Just click a couple more buttons. Hopefully everybody can see my screen now.
Yes,
so great. So my name is Dale McKay. I am a senior technical marketing architect with the security business unit. That's actually kind of a new role for me. I've been in that role for about a month now. In my previous role, I was a network and security technical account manager, and you can see a little bit of my experience on the slide there. In particular, spent quite a bit of time working with Dell Technologies as they implemented various security components or security products, if you will, that VMware provides, like NSX, also a product called AppDefense we're going to talk a little bit more about later. And have really been involved in security in a lot of different environments and different roles over the years. And you can see some of my certifications over here. So what I wanted to do today was to not bring you a marketing presentation, but rather to talk in depth about some of my field experience in working with these customers, and to really give everybody a nice overview of the security architecture that you can develop using the various VMware security products, from Carbon Black to NSX to Secure State. We're going to talk a little bit about each one of those products, because the customers I see really be successful in implementing a comprehensive security architecture actually embrace all of those products and understand how to go about integrating them into that overall security architecture. So again, this is an overview. We're not going to do any deep dives into any of the products. We'll obviously talk about this from an architectural perspective. I will mention some best practices, but hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll have a better understanding of how all these piece parts that VMware offers, Carbon Black, NSX, Secure State, how all those might fit together to give you that comprehensive security architecture. As I move through the presentation, if you have questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask those questions, or you can use the Q&A functionality, and I'll circle back. I'll get back to those questions once I conclude the presentation. So first off, let's kind of set the stage. As we know, if you work in the industry today, security is a primary topic for a lot of conversations that we have. Unfortunately, most of what you see on the screen now applies to most organizations. We still find that there's a siloed mentality to a lot of organizations. The older the organization, the more likely that they have this siloed mentality. Most of the products that we see, or a lot of the legacy products that we see, are also threat-centric, meaning that they are focused on identifying threats, not necessarily classifying whether something is a threat or not. It's just a simple signature match type perspective. And lastly, a lot of those security products kind of get added on, if you will. If you think about any of the workloads that you might develop in the data center, or even some of the end user compute platforms, you know, there's probably a step somewhere that says add XYZ legacy security product. So it has that real kind of bolted on feel to it, that it's just an add-on. So we kind of need to step back and also look at, within these siloed organizations, what are some of their really major points of concern. If we take a look at the InfoSec team, obviously these guys are at the point of the sword in terms of the tip of the spear, if you will, in terms of working with InfoSec security and keeping really all the organizations secure. I mentioned I'd worked with Dell. They have a pretty extensive InfoSec team, but in working with these guys, you really realize that these guys are indeed the tip of the sword. And some of the things that they look to do is they try and harden or reduce that attack surface. And obviously, they're in the business of prevention, malware, ransomware, et cetera. And for those things that they can't prevent, they want to be able to detect and respond. So the InfoSec team really has a considerable number of questions and areas of concern that they need to address with the products that we're going to discuss. The application team also has some particular questions and interests that they need solved for their particular team. You know, are the processes correct? You know, I may have a process that executes every night for 60 days, and then all of a sudden that process is different. Do I have tools in place to capture that difference or that change in that process? Next, the network team. And coming from a physical network background, the network team is always concerned about the internal network. You know, we, for a long time, we've had concepts of private VLANs, of ACLs at layer 3 interfaces, things like that, trying to make that internal network secure. One thing that we didn't always have visibility to, I guess, depending upon the environment that you worked in, was do I have malicious traffic? Do I have IDS, IPS capabilities in my network? And we're going to talk a little bit about that today also. And is it compartmentalized? Do I have an effective east-west mitigation or a segmentation strategy that limits the lateral movement? And we'll talk about why that's important. And lastly, if I've moved applications or workloads to the cloud, now I have another team that's involved, and that's the cloud team. And it says, you know, are my public cloud environments configured securely? We see almost on a weekly, if not daily basis, misconfigurations in the public cloud that lead to compromise and breaches. So we need a tool that understands that environment and can provide us that visibility to look inside the public cloud and see that we have indeed configured our environment securely. Let me just pause right there for just a minute and ask if there are any questions. I think there may be a couple of chat messages. Nope, no questions there. Anyone? All right, let's continue. So like I mentioned, it's pretty hard to solve with some of these legacy approaches. We have the siloed teams. We probably have too many tools depending upon which organization that you're working with. You may have anywhere from 10 to 15 to as many as 60 different tools. Yes, I said 60. Even with all those tools, there's probably still some visibility gaps. And lastly, we have these detection gaps, in particular for lateral movement and advanced attacks. I'm just going to throw out one little data point in this area. The Equifax break-in, if you go and research it a little bit, had one breach point, 48 lateral moves, and that allowed them to have a 9-month persistence within the Equifax network. So just think about all the money that Equifax has probably spent on InfoSec, on tools, on training, on personnel, and yet there were 48 lateral moves and a 9-month persistence inside the network. That I would term as a detection gap. So how are we going to transform security? We need to transform it, have it not be siloed, have it be unified, have it be context-centric, and have it feel more built in, like it's part of the product. And when I talk about context-centric, just an illustration of what we mean by context-centric is if I am a system administrator, the fact that I need RDP to different boxes is probably not anything, or it wouldn't be considered anything out of the ordinary for me to be RDPing into various platforms. However, if I did it from an IP address that is not associated with me or the company, then that might be of concern. Or if I did it at 2 a.m. from an IP address that originates outside of the US and we're not a global company, that might be of concern. So that's what we mean by context centric. All of this we call intrinsic security. And that's the phrase that VMware has gone to market with. Sometimes people don't quite understand what we mean by intrinsic. Well, if I back up to this slide, this is what we mean by intrinsic. It's unified, it's context centric, and it has a built-in feel, the sense that the product has the security capabilities built into it. We're going to look at 4 major areas today. We're going to look at carbon black. We're going to look at workloads, securing your workloads. We're going to look at the network using NSX. And last, we'll look at secure state to secure your cloud environments. Any questions up to this point? Anyone? All right, let's get started. One of the unique capabilities of VMware is the fact that because we have the ability to see all the traffic from every VM at the kernel, and I would encourage you, if you didn't understand that comment I just made, just to go and Google VMware IO chain and you'll understand it then. We have the ability to see all of that traffic. So think about this almost being like a closed circuit TV where I can just set up monitoring points at different places within the network and monitor the traffic that goes through there. We can use different tools to do this and to address those concerns that the application team, the InfoSec team, the network team had. You can see for the InfoSec team, that would be Carbon Black. And Carbon Black is an EDR slash XDR type product. We're not going to do a deep dive into Carbon Black. Carbon Black also has a product called Carbon Black Workload, which integrates with vCenter, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. This is the replacement to the AppDefense product that VMware previously had, and it allows me to implement policies based on application behavior, different postures, and I can really enforce that through the integration between Carbon Black Workload and vCenter. Next, VMware NSX, in particular the Distributed Firewall. This is a product that the network team would focus on. And lastly, Secure State, which provides that secure configuration for the native public cloud. So those are the 4 products that we want to talk about, and we want to see how those products are actually going to assist us in implementing, once again, that overall security architecture that we're talking about today. First, let's begin at the base. And when I say begin at the base, and we're going to focus on 3 kind of key areas as we move through this discussion: hardening, preventing, and then detecting and responding. And we're going to focus first on the ESX host. Surprisingly, a lot of the security issues that you may have read about, in particular ones that affect the vSphere environment, could be mitigated by utilizing just some built-in, again, inherent or intrinsic security capabilities that are available in ESX host. One of the biggest things that I see customers doing or not doing, depending upon their level of security maturity, is to have that management VLAN configured that your ESX hosts are going to attach to, and we'll talk about where else you might use that management VLAN a little bit later. But to actually implement that management VLAN and to put ACLs at the layer 3 interface for that management VLAN, that start to restrict some of that traffic that has access to that management VLAN. There is also a firewall that's available on ESX host and on the vCenter server. Those firewalls, again, should be configured. It doesn't have to be extremely granular in its configuration, but there should be some configuration, at least with reference to the environment that they're operating in. You should also know what the defaults are on that ESX host firewall. For instance, there are some services that are denied by default. So make sure you know what those are. And you can either adjust or change as necessary that firewall rules via the GUI or via the CLI. Just this one step can add quite a bit of security to your VMware infrastructure. I find, again, some of the customers that are not particularly mature in their security stance have no configuration here, or they have not implemented the management VLAN to provide some segmentation there. Next, on ESX host, we have a concept called lockdown mode. And again, we're not going to go a deep dive into lockdown mode, but when you're in lockdown mode, there are logins that get disabled, SSH is denied unless you're on the special user list. CLI access is denied. You can even lock people out from being able to log on to the DCUI if you operate in an environment where you don't need that access. Again, this is one of those security items that is built into the product, but is not widely used as I work with different customers across our customer base. Next, you want to limit the use of those admin accounts, administrator at vsphere.local, if you're in a standalone SSO domain. Also, the AD integration should probably only be used if it's mandated. There have been instances where a Active Directory enterprise or domain admin had their account compromised, and they were also a vSphere admin on that account. So obviously that led to not only a compromise of the AD environment, but also a compromise of the vSphere infrastructure. And all user access should certainly be logged via syslog. In a VMware world, that would be through vRealize Log Insight, but it's more important that you log that access via syslog and that somebody's actually tracking when someone is logging into the ESX host. Now, that may sound like a lot of work. If you're a vSphere admin, you may say, wow, that's, you just gave me a couple of days, maybe even a couple of weeks worth of work. But there is a process that you can go and verify that you've implemented some of these steps correctly. And that is to rely on some of the compliance packs that we have available for the VROPS platform. And you can see I mentioned one of them here, the compliance pack for the Center for Internet Security. If you're not familiar with the CIS benchmarks, I encourage you to go and become familiar with those. The benchmark for vSphere 7 is out now, and you can take a look at that. That certainly should be at least a starting point for becoming compliant and being able to demonstrate that compliance with that particular security framework. And probably the step up from that would be to implement NIST compliance, which would be more detailed, but there is also guidance on how to implement that NIST compliance from VMware. So any questions about the ESX host at this point? All right, let's move ahead. Let's talk about securing the network. This is where we're going to move into the NSX product set. And the first thing we want to talk about is the NSX Distributed Firewall. And this is where you would be able to implement that east-west traffic policy. One of the things that NSX allows you to do is to limit that lateral movement that I mentioned when we were talking briefly about the Equifax breach. I mentioned that there were 48 lateral moves, and I'm not going to say that NSX would have prevented each one of those moves, because obviously it depends on the policy that NSX is implementing. But NSX is a tool that would have prevented, or could have prevented, some of those lateral movements. Again, that distributed firewall is primarily used for east-west traffic. It is FIPS certified. That traffic doesn't have to leave the ESX host and go somewhere and be evaluated only to return back to the ESX host. That's what we mean by no need for U-turns, because again, we're able to see the traffic as it is being processed by the ESX host. We're able to take action on it at kernel speed or CPU speed within that ESX host and make decisions before that traffic ever leaves the ESX host. The distributed firewall can be as granular as you want to write rules to, and we'll talk in just a minute, we'll talk about how the best way to write some of those rules. All right, next, the Edge Services Gateway Firewall. This is primarily intended for north-south traffic. It does support stateful and stateless traffic. We can protect it via vSphere HA, and you can also run it in ECMP mode. When you're in ECMP mode, however, you give up the ability to operate in a stateful environment. Everything, all the traffic there has to be stateless. Next, NSX Manager, which is part of the whole NSX product offering. Again, you want to make sure that that NSX Manager is connected to that management VLAN that we talked about. Again, you should have the management interfaces for not just NSX Manager, not just ESX host, but vCenter. All of your appliances should be on that management network, and that management network, again, should have some ACLs at whatever layer 3 interface that VLAN connects to that provide you some limit of the people who can actually access that management network. By default, the SSH is disabled, and unless you need SSH on the NSX Manager, be my suggestion to do that. And lastly, you want to make sure that you do configure the backups for NSX Manager. And you can check your work again using one of the compliance packs for VROPS, and that would be the management pack for NSX and vSphere. Did I hear a question out there? Nope. All right, let's keep moving. Next, let's talk about securing the workloads. And when we talk about securing the workloads, this is where we're going to talk about kind of almost multiple products. First, we're going to talk about the NSX Distributed Firewall. And one of my biggest encouragements to someone who's going to be implementing NSX is to do the planning ahead of time. If you are architecting at the keyboard as you're implementing NSX, your implementation is probably going to be suboptimal. And here's why I say that. When we think about physical firewalls, and again, this is what I grew up on. I think maybe some people on this call have that same background. We would implement rules in firewalls based on IPs primarily. And there were other rule sets that we could put in place, but primarily it was done on an IP basis. If we develop a comprehensive tagging policy, and you can see that right here, what we now develop firewall rules on are tags. And the dynamic nature of putting devices into a tagging policy allows us to be very dynamic in our firewall rule set creation and implementation. So you see over here on the distributed firewall, I mentioned develop this macro, meso, micro segmentation strategy. And a lot of people struggle with that. A lot of customers struggle with that because they say, well, I want to do the micro segmentation thing. Where's the button for that? Where's the easy button for that? And there is no easy button for that. What it takes is planning and tagging to really start to achieve this segmentation strategy. And when we talk about macro, meso, micro segmentation, again, because we're looking at the distributed firewall, we're really talking about east-west traffic. So by implementing these tags, I can begin to develop that process. And then by refining the tags, I can further refine that segmentation strategy. And I can do all of this without really paying attention to any of the IP addressing or other physical type related characteristics of the workloads, be they data center, end user, whatever they may be. I hope that came across as a really huge point for implementing NSX. If you haven't implemented NSX and you're going to develop your tagging strategy first, if you have implemented NSX and you don't have a viable tagging strategy, then you need to really figure out how you can move to that viable tagging strategy that allows you that granular access or granular application of the firewall rules. All right, next. Also within NSX now we have the IDS, IPS, and last line capabilities. So this gives us that NDR capability that we didn't have in some of the earlier versions of NSX. And this is an IDS, IPS that's integrated in to NSX. I configure it, I manage it from the NSX manager, and it allows me to see those network-based breach attempts or nefarious traffic, if you will, and to either detect it and block it. I can do either one with the latest IPS and IDS. I also wanted to mention that I see a lot of my really successful customers implementing vRealize Network Insight. And the reason for this is because it gives us visibility into the traffic that's in the vSphere infrastructure. It supports IPFix. It also supports NetFlow for those physical devices. You could have the top of the rack switches or the end of the row switches, however you're configured, providing their NetFlow information into vRealize Network Insight, and it would give you a fuller picture of the traffic that is flowing in your environment. I think we spent enough time talking about tagging policy, maybe. The primary thing that I would say about tagging policy is that you must have a coherent tagging policy if you're going to have a successful NSX implementation. And lastly, again, I can check my work by utilizing some of those VROPS compliance packages. Again, going back to the CIS benchmark, that's a document that you will want to become familiar with. Any questions about the NSX portion of this? All right, let's go take a look at how we might go about securing the application. And one of the best ways to secure the application is to utilize our Carbon Black workload product. This was this product is the development or the integration of Carbon Black into that AppDefense platform. And what it does is it allows us to establish a baseline policy across our entire data center. A baseline policy that says, could be anything from no USB access, could be I don't want a certain application to ever run, and I can blacklist that application based on the hash of that application. That's how granular the policy can be. And by implementing that policy across the data center, I can now establish what that baseline is going to be. One of the other really nice things that Carbon Black Workload does is it does a vulnerability scan of those workloads that are part of the Carbon Black Workload or that are available, that have been enabled within the Carbon Black Workload. Those vulnerabilities produce a number. That number is a Kena score number. It's not just a CVSS number, which is a pretty static number. It's a Kena scoring number. If you're not familiar with Kena, they take a lot of dynamic factors and integrate them into that score. So that score might start off at, let's say, a 4.8, which maybe some organizations would push to a quarterly update for remediation. But based on factors that may happen, maybe an exploit shows up. If any of this sounds vaguely familiar based on the past couple of weeks, that's kind of where I'm heading with my story. Maybe an exploit shows up in the wild for a previously patched issue that didn't get fully patched. And now that Kena score might go from a 4.8 to like an 8.5 or even a 9. It's a dynamic nature of that score that really allows you to rank order those vulnerabilities that you have in your data center for remediation. And that's available, again, through implementing the Carbon Black Workload product. It's an appliance. It comes in an OVA form factor. It probably takes about 15 minutes to implement that and to get it integrated in with your vCenter and with your Carbon Black Cloud account. When you integrate it in with vCenter, what you wind up with is a plugin that allows you to access the information that the Carbon Black Workload appliance provides, as well as see those visibilities and directly tie or gives you visibility to the vulnerabilities, and then to be able to directly tie those vulnerabilities to a particular VM. I said that we were context aware, and we are through the use of the IDM platform. That provides a lot of contextual awareness. We can have those application-specific alerts, and we, of course, can have the automated threat detection and response as part of that baseline policy that I mentioned. When we do detect a threat, we can block the process. We can also shut down or quarantine an endpoint. And lastly, through application validation is really the best place for you to go and check your compliance in terms of implementing the Carbon Black Workload. All right, any questions about Carbon Black Workload before I move on? Anyone? All right. Lastly, let's talk about securing the cloud. We have a product called Secure State. And what Secure State allows me to do, and first off, you can see over here on the left, it's available for AWS and for Azure. As we're speaking, I think the GCP is probably just about to be released or has been released. I've been out on PTO for the past couple of weeks, so that release may have actually occurred and I missed it. It is a SaaS model. Again, we're operating in the public cloud, so you would expect it to be that SaaS model. And there's no agents required. Everything's API driven. And what Secure State allows us to do is to understand in real time what our security posture is in our public cloud. It understands accounts. It understands different environments. It understands permissions. It understands all of that. And it also employs what you see here, this violation chain of reporting. And what we mean by that is you could have a particular situation in a public cloud where you might have one or two misconfigured items. And those one or two misconfigured items may not necessarily present a security issue in and of themselves. But when I combine them together and think about a permissions issue thing, a permissions issue situation and an access situation where if I had someone's permissions misconfigured, but they didn't have access, I wouldn't have an issue. Or vice versa, if someone had access misconfiguration, but their permissions were correct, then I may not have a problem. But if I had both of those, say, incorrectly configured, now I've got a problem. So that's the violation chain that we're talking about when we talk about secure state. And it's that violation chain that allows us to get really deep insight into how the public cloud is secured. And again, because of that deep understanding of accounts, permissions, access, it allows us to be very context aware, and it allows us to correlate some of these events and changes. So if someone goes in and inadvertently provides public access to an S3 bucket in AWS, that would be something that would be noted, and there would obviously be an alert raised on the fact that we had moved outside of our established policy, if indeed that was our policy. Now it works on a baseline, and it's very much in line with, we talk about declarative policies now that say, okay, I want this policy, I want you to implement it. And if there are any changes to it, I want you to essentially reverse those changes, or at a minimum, notify me about those changes so that I can go and reverse it. So in a quick recap, we have kind of talked about, we started at the ESX host. We talked about how you might go about securing that ESX host. Then we talked about how I might secure the network using NSX. Then we talked about how I might secure my workloads or my application using Carbon Black Workload. And then lastly, we've talked about how I might secure my public cloud environments using Secure State. So that's really a four-prong overall architecture approach to security that provides a very well thought out security architecture that is flexible and can be dynamic. Again, going back to that tagging conversation, can be very dynamic in the sense that as I add workloads, if I have them properly tagged, whether I'm adding them from VRA, manually, whatever the case may be, if I adhere to that tagging policy, then I know that they're going to come in and be protected from the moment that they're instantiated. Lastly, I wanted to leave you with a couple of security compliance frameworks and tools that you might utilize, because at the end of the day, compliance is really all about verifying and being able to verify for an audit entity what my current security stance is. A good place to start is the Center for Internet Security. They have the CIS controls. They also have benchmarks. If you're operating in a public cloud environment, they have the CIS hardened images. The next step up from that would be NIST. VMware has a NIST 800-53 compliance kit. And now the current NIST guidance is 800-53 Rev 5. And there's also the NIST security frameworks. There's also a series of documents, the SP 1800 series, that kind of specifically look at ransomware. Next, we have some tools. I had mentioned this before, the Center for Internet Security VROPS Compliance Pack. Again, this takes probably less than 10 minutes to implement that compliance pack, and it will go through your entire environment and report back on those devices that are not in compliance with the Center for Internet Security benchmarks. There's the user guide. You can see the link to it there. And then here's that NIST 800-53 compliance kit that I'd previously mentioned. With that, I will say thank you. I'm at about 35 after the hour. I wanted to leave a few minutes for questions. So Ben, I will turn it back over to you. And if there are any questions, feel free to come off mute.
Thank you, Dale. Yes, anyone that wants to ask a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask. Is anyone using NSX today?
Yes, we have quite a few customers that are using NSX. Now, there are two variations of NSX. There's NSX V and NSXT. NSXV was the original product. I think you're seeing a lot of our customers moving away from that and moving more towards the NSXT product. One of the biggest differentiators between those two products is the NSXV product had a one-to-one relationship with vCenter, whereas the NSXT product does not, meaning that I can have multiple vCenters attached to a single NSX manager.
Very nice. Is anyone attending the call using NSX?
And by the way,
or thinking about getting started with it? Sorry.
Yeah, and no, it's all right, Ben. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You had mentioned VMUG Advantage before. I believe NSX is one of the products that's available on the VMUG Advantage also.
It is.
So for those of you that want to get used to implementing NSX or just understanding some of that distributed firewall concepts that I mentioned, that's a great way to do it, is to implement it in your home lab. I would definitely recommend working with NSXT, as that's the going forward product. NSXV is on a limited lifetime. The date kind of keeps changing, so I'm not going to give you a date, but NSXT is definitely the product going forward.
Yeah, you can see here it's definitely included in eval experience, NSXT data center evaluation. So you get a year's worth of a year's license for that each time you subscribe. So definitely cool.
Yeah. Any more questions? Anything at all in terms of security or compliance,
hey, Dale,
for that matter? Yes.
Hey, Dale, it's Sean. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Question, with announcements like the Hello Kitty ransomware that came out where it's directly going at the ESXi hosts, we're trying to balance in our team of how much locking down do we do versus what historical things we do as far as maintenance management, what gets blocked when we start really locking, like overly locking things down. Do you see ESXi management evolving differently now, with trying to probably by default kind of be hardened out of the box a little bit more, and then maybe moving those management pieces to another layer or in vCenter or something? Or we're just trying to figure out where we go with it.
Yeah, I don't really see a lot of that. I haven't seen that be discussed at product management level, of moving management to a different layer, if you will. What I have seen product managers, particularly on the ESX and the vCenter side, talk about is implementing a lot of those best practices that I mentioned. Implementing the firewalls, implementing the management VLAN. You would almost be surprised at how many customers don't implement a management VLAN, or if they do, there's no ACL at the layer 3 interface to limit traffic to that management VLAN. So that would be one of the key points that I would bring up in discussion with your team if I was sitting there having that discussion with them. Another one would be, if you have that management VLAN, And the accounts that you use to access your vSphere environment, are they replicated for AD administration? In other words, is one of my AD enterprise or domain admins, if that account gets compromised, have I also compromised one of my vSphere admin accounts? That's one of the things that we have seen in the past that really lent itself to the further compromise of different environments. And I'm choosing my words pretty carefully there. But again, this goes back to that point that I made, that if AD integration is not required or not mandated, then it's almost our best practice at this point to not make that connection.
Gotcha. Understood. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, and as Monica mentioned, there are multiple NSX labs in the VMware hands-on labs that you can take too to try to get started and learn about it as well.
Yeah, one last thing I wanted to mention is there's a techzone.vmware.com. That's where a lot of really techie kind of information is now being stored within VMware. It's very much a work in progress at this point, but I think that's probably a site that you would want to bookmark, techzone.vmware.com.